In this video, we're going to talk about patterns of evolution. We're going to talk a little bit about speciation, what it is, how it occurs, some of the different types of evolution that you'll see are patterns of evolution, and then we're going to talk about some theories on how evolution occurs, thanks to some modern day evidence. So there are five main patterns of evolution, and you should be able to define all five of these. The first is divergent evolution, and this is when species are going to evolve into two separate species. And so that's essentially what speciation is. It's when there's a common ancestor, and from that common ancestor, you have two species that branch off from that common ancestor. And so that's divergent evolution. So it's when similar species become more or become different. You have convergent evolution, which is when two unrelated species evolve, but they evolve similar adaptations because of their environments that they share. So a very good example of this is whales and fish. Whales, as you know, are mammals, but they have a lot of characteristics of fish. They have fins, they have a streamlined body, some characteristics that are very similar to fish. However, we know from phylogenetic analysis that whales are not closely related to fish. So why do they have this similar traits? It's because they adapted to similar environments, which is the water. Parallel evolution is when two related species develop similar adaptations after that they diverge from a common ancestor. So it's essentially when they are two separate species, they're not going to mate, but they are very closely related still. So parallel evolution you can think of coming right off of that node on a phylogenetic tree. And the best example of this is a gray wolf, which is found in North America, is super closely related to the Tasmanian wolf, which is found in Australia. So they're very closely related, they have very similar adaptations, and they have a very recent common ancestor. Coevolution is the evolution of interacting species that reciprocally affect each other. And so what that means, or the best example of that, is pollinators and flowers. As flowers evolve various adaptations, pollinators will continue to evolve a way to find that food source, and then flowers will adapt to be better pollinated by those pollinators. So any predator-prey relationship really shows coevolution well. And then adaptive radiation is when you have one common ancestor that splits off into numerous species. And the best example of this is Darwin's finches. Here are a couple of diagrams showing you what divergent, convergent, parallel evolution look like. This diagram up here is just showing a bird and a flower. So this bird is also a pollinator indirectly. So these two guys are going to evolve or co-evolve together. And then here you can see a very common finch ancestor evolving into, or adapting off, radiating off into various different species of finches, each of which will occupy their own niche or their own special place in a habitat. And so all of these finches are adapted to different food sources on different islands in the Galapagos Islands, where Darwin studied all of these finches. Moving on to speciation and how it's what leads to speciation, we first need to define what a species is. A species is a group of closely related organisms that have the potential to interbreed with one another. So if the organisms can still breed with other organisms, they are considered a species. And when we talk about speciation, we're talking about that divergent evolution, so a common ancestor splitting off. How does that occur? Well, that's going to occur through reproductive isolation, meaning that those organisms no longer want to interbreed with one another for whatever reason. And so there are two reasons or two types of speciation that we talk about. You have allopatric and sympatric. Allopatric speciation is caused by geographic barriers. So there's some geographic barrier that causes or a population to be split. And so each of these different populations are going to evolve separately, like you can see in the diagram. Sympatric speciation occurs without a geographic barrier, and we're going to talk about what can cause sympatric speciation in the next slide. So there are five main causes of sympatric speciation, meaning without a geographic barrier. Why do those organisms no longer want to interbreed? The first is polyploidy. So we've talked about haploid and diploid organisms. Polyploidy is when there's more than two complete sets, so there's more than 2N. This is due to non-disjunction. If you remember, non-disjunction is during meiosis when those homologous chromosomes don't separate properly. And so you can get an organism that maybe is 4N or 6N or 8N. It's really common in plants. Bananas are a great example of a plant that undergo polyploidy. But plants that are polyploids cannot breed with others of the same species, and so they become reproductively isolated, meaning they can no longer interbreed with one another. So those plants are pretty common with that. Habitat isolation is when organisms live in the same area, but there's really little interaction. So, for example, if you have a snake species living in the same geographic area, but some are on land, some are on water, they don't interact very much. So they're going to evolve separately. Behavioral isolation is when species do not mate due to differences in courtship behavior. There's a ton of examples with fireflies. Males will actually attract females by flashing their lights, and females can actually tell what species or those lightning bugs are, those fireflies are. So the courtship behavior separates those organisms. Temporal isolation is when species will become sexually mature or active at different times. For example, some fish species only want to mate at night while others do during the day. Same with plants. And then you also have reproductive isolation, which is, remember, when organisms no longer mate with one another, which is the primary driving force of speciation. You have two types of barriers of reproductive isolation. You have prezygotic and postzygotic. Pre means before, zygotic talking about zygote. So prezygotic barriers mean that organisms cannot even breed to produce an offspring. It's impossible for them to do that. Post-zygotic barriers are barriers that inhibit the zygote from becoming viable or actually developing. So that will occur after the zygote is formed, but it won't last through the gestation period. This is a really good example of sympatric speciation. You have the hawthorn flies and apple maggot flies, both of which have a very common ancestor. However, they develop different hosts, meaning that they began to feed on different food sources, and so they are slowly becoming two different species, not due to a geographic barrier, but rather due to a shift in their host or their food source. And then lastly, very quickly, the theory of evolution, modern theory of evolution. So there's two ideas, gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. Gradualism is the idea that species change slowly over a long period of time. However, that idea has been refuted because of fossil evidence. With fossil evidence, if gradualism were true, you would expect to find missing links or a fossil for every single transitional organism over geological time. However, the fossil record has many gaps. We actually are missing a ton of fossils that link organisms. For example, the movement from organisms from land to water. If you have a chance, read the book Your Inner Fish. It actually talks about that and finding that missing link. However, that missing link has not been found for all of these organisms. So these two guys, Stephen Gould and Niles Eldredge, developed this theory of punctuated equilibrium. It's pretty much the opposite of gradualism. What they said was that these changes that occur are not slow, they're actually very rapid, and they occur multiple times throughout they occur multiple times throughout evolutionary time. And they suggested that this occurs due to the mechanism of allopatric speciation, so using a geographic barrier that suddenly separates this original population and allows for divergent evolution to occur.